This is a Thinking Aloud podcast from the BBC, and for more details and our terms of use and much, much more about Thinking Aloud, go to our website at bbc.co.uk. Hello. Apologies for the quality of my voice this week, but there is one consolation. This programme will be devoted to an interview I conducted in rather better vocal times with the American philosopher of law and human rights, Martha Nussbaum. Nussbaum has directly criticised current trends in higher education in her recent book, Not for Profit, Why Democracy Needs the Humanities. But more significantly, she's devoted a great part of her academic life to practical philosophy, to the establishment of a set of basic principles which, if recognised by governments and other institutions, would allow all citizens of the world to have a fulfilled and dignified life. In this enterprise, she claims to have found stimulation and encouragement in the work of such other prominent citizens of the world as Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and Tagore.
I thought that my voyage had come to its end at the last limit of my power, that the path before me was closed, that provisions were exhausted, and the time come to take shelter in a silent obscurity. But I find that thy will knows no end in me, and when old words die out on the tongue, new melodies break forth from the heart. And where the old tracks are lost, new country is revealed with its wonders.
Martha's latest book, Creating Capabilities, is an account of her 10 basic principles of justice. But when I spoke to her on the line to Chicago University, where she's Professor of Law and Ethics, I began by talking about her recent book in defence of the humanities. Did she believe in the centrality of the humanities to education, primarily because of their ability to develop our capacity for fellow feeling?
We know now that young babies can already put themselves in the position of another when they're under 1 year old, but of course, it's their parent. It's a very narrow circle. And so we come into the world with this basic ability. But if it's going to be cultivated in a way that makes a person a good citizen, it has to be developed. And it has to be developed by teaching you facts about the world, showing you something about what the life of other groups is like, and then by encouraging you to put yourself in the place of those different groups. And I think literature and the arts are indispensable in this. And not just at the school level, but also at the university level, where, as Mill said, they can be taught with increasing sophistication, and you can get a kind of cultivation that you couldn't get earlier.
You've talked, I think, in one place about Americans as rather wandering through the world as though they already knew all about it, and you feel that a greater reading of history, and in particular history of world religions, might do something to improve that attitude.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think the cultivation of the imagination and learning some facts have to go hand in hand, because Americans do somehow assume that they can wander through the world speaking English and eating at McDonald's and so on. And to wake them up, to get them to see what the lives of others are like, it's crucial to begin that early when little children are learning about other religions. But of course, once again, it can be done with increasing sophistication when young people get to university. And I do think that learning something about what the major world religions are, their internal diversity, and the subtle account of them that you get in a real university course is crucial for a good public debate about these things.
Do you have a belief that it is possible to educate the emotions? Which empathy, we can count that as an emotion, can't we? We can talk about what a capacity for education to improve that.
Well, I think actually empathy is an ability that is morally neutral in the sense that a good sadist can have plenty of empathy with the victim and use that to torture the victim. So empathy has to be complemented by learning why other people matter, by a cultivation of moral concern for other people, and that has to begin very early in the family and in the schools. But it can, once again, we can augment it at the higher education level by just teaching some things about what poverty does to the human spirit, what people really are suffering when they suffer from malnutrition and lack of education in other countries. And so I think if people are hopeless sociopaths, they're not going to learn to care about other people through learning those facts. But if they have a basic kind of human concern by that time, then learning the facts with a rich kind of imaginative depiction can make a big difference.
I mean, because we were always reminded, weren't we, whenever the idea was entered that if people had a proper knowledge of the humanities, of literature, of music, of Mozart, of Beethoven or whatever, then they were likely to feel a sensitivity towards their fellow citizens of the country and of the world. But then it was pointed out, of course, that the Nazis read Goethe, which is always really rather a difficult fact to accommodate to this celebration of the humanities.
Well, I don't think it's difficult at all, because we know a lot about Nazi education now, and we know that it lacked two big things. The first is any kind of sympathetic confrontation with minority perspectives. Jews were depicted as insects, as vermin in books for children. And, of course, then in more adult books, they were depicted as threats to the culture. So what I'm talking about is a kind of deliberate cultivation of the perspective of different minority groups and groups that you need to understand if you're going to think well about them. The other thing Nazi education really lacked, and we haven't talked about this yet, is critical thinking. The cultivation of the ability to stand apart, to say, look, this is a bad argument and I'm not going to go along with that. And of course, as Adorno showed, the Nazi family was very authoritarian. It discouraged the critical capacity in children from the very beginning. And of course, as time went on, the educational system cultivated kind of blind obedience. Even, I would say, the philosophical culture. I think Heidegger was a terrible teacher of students. He cultivated blind obedience, and that's not what we want.
I mean, one of the things which interferes with the possibility of the type of, if you like, universal empathy or whatever, I mean, there are institutional ways in which, the family, for example, or religion we might talk about, or patriotism, these are all elements which, if you like, interfere with people's capacity to have wider empathy, don't they?
Well, I think it all depends how they're constructed. Now, I'm writing actually now a book about patriotism and other political emotions, and I think there are different types of patriotism. There is the kind that urges blind obedience, but then there's another kind, and I think Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Lincoln, and so on were all great artists of this kind of patriotism that cultivates the ability to think critically, the ability to stand up to authority and say, no, this is wrong. And in fact, Gandhi's favorite song was a song written by the poet and educator Rabindranath Tagore, who, of course, I write about a lot, and who was a real advocate of Socratic critical thinking. And this is a song that says, if no one speaks up, then you speak up alone. Speak alone, speak alone. And then it goes on, and then it says, if no one shows a light, then you, lighting your own ribs, burn on alone. So imagine thousands of people marching along with Gandhi singing this song. And it's quite interesting to think of that combination of solidarity with critical independence that he was wonderful at cultivating.
I was interested also in the way in which you picked up, I think, on John Rawls' sort of legal philosopher's notion that, in a way, patriotism, far from being exclusive, could almost teach people to have a wider appreciation of those within their own country, which could then extend to the world.
Well, I think this is a theme that's common to all the people that I've just mentioned. Martin Luther King Jr. always emphasized that this was something having to do with all the people of the world. So too did Lincoln. If you look at his speeches, there's always at the end a reference to the larger world. Franklin Delano Roosevelt insisted in his Second Bill of Rights speech that he kept saying all over the world, and his advisors said, well, take that part out, and the Americans don't want to hear about that. But he insisted on keeping it in. And, think about Nehru's speech on the eve of Indian independence, where he could have said, rah, rah, India is now a separate country, isn't this great? And instead he says, these dreams are for India, but they are also for the world, for all the nations and peoples are too closely knit together, I can't remember the exact words, for anyone to think that it can live apart. So there we are. If you have a dream of ending poverty and misery, you better dream it for the whole world, because otherwise we're all going to sink together.
And this is where, of course, we can begin begin to turn to your more recent book, Creating Capabilities, because what we're talking about here, we're looking for something that can be agreed upon, a set of political principles, if you like, systems of justice, which could be embraced, which could be accepted all over the world. When you turn to tackling this question of what might we all agree upon as reasonable principles by which we behave, your idea is to concentrate, isn't it, upon this notion of capabilities. Explain capabilities to me.
Okay. Capabilities are opportunities. They're what my collaborator Amartya Sen, the economist, calls substantial freedoms. That means you only have a capability if you're really in a total position, both in terms of your education and your internal formation and in terms of the opportunities that society gives you in the social context to actually choose something. Now, it's an opportunity for choice. So, if your culture teaches you not to use that opportunity, fine. You don't use it. And that's one way we get around some of the charges of imposition. But it is a real choice. And that means that suppose you've been brought up and educated well, but your country does not afford you the opportunity of religious freedom and freedom of speech, then you just don't have that capability.
So in this set of capabilities, you are describing what people actually able to be and do, whether or not they choose to do it or not. And you want to set this, you want to call this the human development approach. And this is an idea of development which in a way is premised against traditional notions in which development is measured in terms of economic growth, in terms of GDP.
Yeah, what I've done is to turn this into a minimal theory of justice. But the approach began in the development context, where everyone was talking about the quality of life in nations, but they were measuring that in this very crude way by just looking at GDP per capita. Now, of course, that's an average, so it doesn't even talk about distribution, and it can give very high marks to countries that have staggering inequalities. But then there's another problem, which is it's a single number. And it doesn't, therefore, identify different parts of human life that are all very meaningful and that are not that well correlated with GDP, even if we did factor in distribution. Think about political rights and liberties, which I think are an extremely important aspect of a human being's quality of life. Now, we all know, looking at China and other nations around the world, that increased GDP is not very strongly correlated with increased political and religious freedom. And then, if we even look at some things that seem more closely connected, health and education, we now know through empirical studies, and Sen and his collaborator Jean Drèze have done some very good field studies of the different Indian states, that increased GDP is not very strongly correlated with improved quality of health care and education. So that states in India that are actually poor and that have not improved GDP have done very well with education through direct state intervention. But other states in India that have got increased GDP through a policy of foreign investment have not raised their health and education indicators. So the moral is you got to look at each area and you've got to see what people are actually able to do and to be in each of those areas.
Let's just turn to your list of central capabilities. If you take the first one, you talk about under the heading of life, and you write, being able to live to the end of a human life of normal length, not dying prematurely or before one's life is so reduced as to be not worth living. And then under, for example, bodily integrity, the third one, being able to move freely from place to place, to be secure against violent assault, including sexual assault and domestic violence, having opportunities for sexual satisfaction and for choice in matters of reproduction. As I go down the list, some people might be quite surprised to hear some of the headings for these. For example, if we take something like emotions, it's rather odd to see emotions being described as a capability. So could you perhaps just expand on that, fill that out for me?
Well, of course, what these things are supposed to be are abstract norms which then different nations can turn into written constitutional law or some other kind of law if they don't have a written constitution, but basic entitlements, which can be cashed out in a much more specific level by each nation in accordance with its history. Now, the emotions one, it looks like it's very remote, but it isn't at all so remote, because if you think about what women lack around the world, and this was really my starting point in my earlier development work in India, one of the great things that they lack is freedom from fear. And, of course, that's something that many poor people lack, not just women. Roosevelt made that the linchpin of his New Deal policies, freedom from fear. But anyway, fear, because they're afraid of course, not having enough to eat, because they're more malnourished than males are, but also, fear of being beaten, fear of violence in the street. And I think this is true in the rich countries as well as the poor countries. I mean, I know I myself, one time I was in Finland and thought, this is a pretty safe country, so I think I'll go out at night and take a walk in the forest. And I found I couldn't enjoy it, even though it probably was quite safe, because the fear was so deeply built in. And I had just learned through years of fear that I couldn't walk alone in a place at night. So, it cripples your ability to enjoy nature, to enjoy interactions with other people. But if you're afraid of violence within your own home, and a huge number of women all over the world, rich countries and poor, are afraid of that every day of their lives, well, then there's very little that you can enjoy in life. So now how could a nation address that? Well, they can't stop everything, but they can certainly aggressively enforce laws against domestic violence, and they can make sure, for example, as our Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals in Chicago recently held, that somebody who's been convicted of misdemeanor domestic violence is no longer able to own a gun. And there are many things that law can do here to make domestic violence less a source of crippling anxiety.
But to some extent, these capabilities, we're not talking about innate, are we? These desires, these ideas of how you might fulfill yourself as a human being are dependent upon education and upon environment in the first place.
I think that's absolutely right. I think we all have some innate capacities that ultimately get developed in different ways, but that's not really the focus of the approach. The focus is on just thinking, what would a minimally flourishing life include, and how can we make sure that people have that? And certainly freedom from unreasonable fear is one of the things. Another emotion that I'm interested in is actually anger, because anger is a source of political change, and the ability to protest against injustice is one of the things that often people are deprived of, because they're brought up being told, this is your place forever. There's no changing it. You better not protest. And that's one of the horrible things about both poverty and racial and gender discrimination, that it makes allies out of the oppressed. Therefore, to allow people their space for anger and protest is another very important thing. How would a society do that? Protection of the freedom of speech, but also fostering forms of affiliation and solidarity where people can get together and learn about their history, learn about what's wrong. The Indian government supports a lot of groups where women are brought together to talk about their situation, to learn how to protest unjust treatment on the part of their employers and their husbands. So, you can do a lot to foster a kind of justified and peaceful use of anger to effect political change.
But mightn't this somehow be seen by some people, rather as human rights has been, almost a Western export? Let's, for example, say, you were talking about free speech and free association. Now, quite clearly, governments are able to change circumstances in order to allow that degree of free speech. But on the other side, individuals, women in particular societies, may well feel that involvement in politics, involvement in free speech is not for them. It is not something that they want. To what extent is your programme to say this is something they should be encouraged to want?
Well, I think that any approach that's going to allow for protest against past injustice cannot be based on people's current preferences, because we know now that people have what are called adaptive preferences, that is, preferences that are adjusted to the low level that people are taught they can achieve. There's a lot of writing about this by now, and it's the case of the fox and the sour grapes. Jan Elster's book, Sour Grapes, uses that story to say, look, when the fox sees he can't get the grapes, he doesn't want to just be longing for them forever. So he says, I don't want them anyway. They were sour. Now, many people all over the world are told these things are out of reach for you. and therefore they learn not to want them. Why should they have lives of unfulfilled longing? But that doesn't mean that these things were not good for them. And so what any movement for social change first has to do is to get people to wake up and consider whether their lives don't include false consciousness. Now, is this Western? I think that's the most extraordinary chauvinism on the part of Western scholars, actually. Because if you think about Gandhi and Nehru, were they taking over notions of freedom of religion and freedom of speech from the West? Good heavens, no. For in their experience, the West, that is the Raj, was the source of the absolute opposite of that, of tyranny, of brutal suppression of the freedom of association. I mean, they were in jail for much of their adult life, and Nehru in particular. So they knew very well that the Raj did not believe in the freedom of association and the freedom of speech, and they defended these norms anyway. And actually, Tagore thinks of them as more indigenous to Indian traditions than to the West, because in his book on nationalism, he says the West is really the source of imperialism and military violence. So anyway, I think we can dispense with the idea that these are peculiarly Western ideas, but we can then ask, well, how do we justify them? I think that in the long run, if over, let's say, many generations, people who were encouraged to deliberate and to think about these things concluded again and again that they had no interest in these things, then we might have some doubt. But in fact, we do find a preference for liberty that springs up very robustly all over the place whenever people get a chance to do it. And good heavens, the women's movement is one of the largest and most successful, although not totally successful, nonviolent protest movements that the world has ever known. And women sure do not want to go back to the days when they didn't vote and they didn't have any political rights.
Let me return just for a second, though, to the Western export idea, because, of course, I mean, a traditional Islamic society might well claim, they have indeed claimed, that when America, for example, promotes the idea of human rights, they see that as an injunction to these societies to break down traditional forms of family and religion, traditional forms of trading, if you like, to open themselves up to capitalism and consumerism and to individualism.
Well, I don't think you should just say traditional Islamic societies. I mean, Islam and Christianity and Judaism all have many different variants. And in all three religions, there are certainly groups that are anti-modern and that would like to urge people to forego the liberties that a modern state affords them. But look, the Islamic tradition, particularly in India, has a glorious tradition of liberty. The Emperor Akbar was one of the world leaders in fostering religious toleration and liberty. And, that Enlightenment tradition in Indian Islam extends all the way to the present through people who founded the University Jamia Millia Islamia, which had a progressive school for girls, which had Hindus and Muslims in the same classes, Hindu and Muslim faculty, and so on. And they worked side by side with Gandhi in the independence movement. So, Islam is many things. And so too is Christianity, and so too is Judaism, my own religion.
So what do you do about people who decide, if you like, not to act on their capabilities? They make poor choices, if you like. They make bad choices. Does the state interfere? Do we stop people taking drugs, stop people smoking, stop people who are not exercising their capabilities in ways of which we approve?
I'm very against that. Now, I think once you form the capability, and that does mean some compulsory things for children, I mean, compulsory health care, compulsory education, then adults should have a wide range of freedoms. Now, of course, we all regulate medical procedures, and people don't have limitless freedom to go in for unsafe surgeries and so on. But with that kind of regulation as a limit, then I think we do allow people to do lots of unhealthy things. And I'm actually not in favor of too much intervention with things like smoking and other bad choices, because I think it's nosy and impertinent. So long as people are educated, so long as they have that information and they have access to help if they want to quit smoking, and then maybe their insurance should pay for that, then that's about all we should do.
Finally, let me just turn to, if you like, implementation. Without being rude, I mean, to some extent, reading through these, one finds it easy enough to approve of them, a bit like motherhood and apple pie. Yes, these are quite clearly, all good things. I mean, I can see if we're talking about something like economic growth, we can measure GDP, we can have hard figures, and we can talk about percentages, and we can say we will do this, even if the economists occasionally get it wrong. They believe they have recipes for doing something about GDP, don't they? I mean, where are the recipes here? How might we measure success?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that we have this international association, the Human Development and Capability Association, with 800 members from 80 countries, a lot of whom are working on precisely that question, because they get that question all the time. So I turn it over to others at some point. But, in terms of my own list, I think that thinking about the history of constitutional law in a country with a written constitution, or just thinking about the implementation of basic entitlements through legislation, show us that these things can be done. How do we know whether there's sufficient freedom of speech in a country? Well, we see what kind of complaints people have, what kind of court cases they bring, and how those cases come out. And we can draw a very sharp picture of how free speech in the U.S. has evolved over time by seeing, for example, that in the early part of the 20th century, free speech of dissidents during wartime was regarded as something you could make illegal, and you could throw people into jail for that. But then over time now, if such a person had interference with their speech today, that person would be on absolutely solid ground and would win a court case hands down. So you just charted through history, and that's a good history is a good measuring device, and it's the right one for that. And so you look around and you figure out what the appropriate way of measuring each thing is.
It is, when I'm talking to you, I'm infected by your enthusiasm, but at the same time, at the back of my head, the sense that we now live in a rather less altruistic world, a world which is less concerned about others, which is more concerned with individualism, perhaps with the way consumerism producing false wants and false desires which perhaps get in the way of all these human capabilities that you're anxious to talk about. How do you remain optimistic in the face of the modern world?
Well, I guess, starting from working on women and their lives helps you be optimistic, because this is the only time in history that you would want to have been born female. You just think back 100 years ago or 150 years ago, and you look at not just voting rights and other things like that, but you look at life expectancy of women around the world. Well, things have improved very greatly. And I think that despite the fact that we still have huge problems and that sex-selective abortion is on the rise in many countries and so on, there's no chance that it'll slip back any more than that there was a chance in the 18th century that feudalism would come back on a large scale. So I think we do see some signs of progress in human history, and we just better keep pushing back the frontiers a little bit more.
Martha Nussbaum. In case you'd like to comment on anything in that interview, here are our addresses. Thinking Aloud, BBC Radio 4, Broadcasting House, London, W1A 1AA, or email us at thinkingaloud@bbc.co.uk. And of course, if you'd like to hear the programme again, consult our archive, sign up for my newsletter, or download our podcast. All you've got to do is go to this website and click through bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Just one last thing. If you have been, thanks so much for sticking with my voice.